Okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof.com, and I'm very pleased to be joined by John Kiriakou, CIA whistleblower, and also a colleague who is a contributor over at Consortium News. Thanks for joining us, John.
Happy to do it, Kevin.
So as we get rolling here, one second. As we get rolling here, let me begin by asking you just generally. I mean, what a day! What an extraordinary day! This decision, and such a turn. I mean, 95% of the ruling as you're going through it sounds horrid. Like we're just in for the inevitable. I was following it in real time. But so other people were following what reporters were putting out there who were following the virtual courtroom. And then suddenly it takes this turn where the judge is taking seriously his mental and physical health. What's your reaction to the outcome here?
I was shocked, very pleasantly so, but shocked. One of the things that really surprised me was that the judge said that the U.S. government had made its case. And I don't think that the U.S. government at all made its case. I think that she said that gratuitously because the UK has something called the Official Secrets Act, which is even more onerous than the Espionage Act. And she wanted to send him back to the U.S. But, in the end, it seems that a cooler head is what ended up prevailing. And she changed her mind. Now, one important point, I think, is that there is a precedent for British courts not sending prisoners back to the United States. And it's specifically because of the way the U.S. uses solitary confinement. The UN considers the U.S. practice of solitary to be a form of torture. The British courts have held that it is a form of torture. And if somebody is mentally or emotionally fragile, it's very, very easy to commit suicide in prisons. Certainly at the federal level, people commit suicide in American prisons every single day. And so in the end, despite the swipes that she took at Julian and Julian's supporters and Julian's actions, in the end, she did the right thing.
You and I, we go back as people who have been following the mass incarceration system in the United States very closely. And it was remarkable to me that, basically the U.S. government had an open and shut case. They could have convinced this, if you read it, assuming that she's not just copping out here. I mean, there's different ways that you can look at what the judge is doing. I see one theory out there that she's just basically using this as a way to not have to engage the charges and find against any of the allegations that were put forward by the U.S. government. And this is a nice thing because, as you say, there's a precedent. There's a precedent here for the UK government not authorizing extraditions to the U.S. because of how people would be abused in the U.S. prison system. But it's remarkable. I mean, I wonder if you have any comment here on the part of the ruling where she basically recognizes that Julian Assange would be held in special administrative measures if he was brought to the United States. And I think, what's so important about this aspect is she ties the fact that she believes he would be put in SAMs to the statements that Mike Pompeo had made about WikiLeaks being a non-state hostile intelligence agency. So I think it's so crucial for her to draw that connection that his treatment in a U.S. prison would be a direct result of how the U.S. government views him.
Yeah, I was actually quite excited by that. And I have to conclude also, Kevin, that, after so many of us have spent the last how many years talking and writing about conditions inside these special communications, these communications management units, CMUs, that the judge actually took this seriously. So many times we talked about how, because Julian was not your run-of-the-mill prisoner who was going to go into an American prison, that he would be placed in solitary confinement. He would be placed in a CMU in some godforsaken place like Florence, the ADX in Florence, or the communications management unit in the penitentiary at Terre Haute. That whatever they decided to do with him, it was going to be terrible. It was going to be a human rights violation. It was going to push the man over the edge mentally. It was going to possibly lead to his suicide. We talked about it so much and held these vigils every month and wrote about it in publications all around the world. I like to think that she took some notice. And like you said, after that outrageous statement by Mike Pompeo that WikiLeaks is a non-state intelligence service, that was just too much. I also wonder too, and if you'll allow me to even ask a question of you, I wonder too if there was any role that the incoming Biden administration played here. I wonder if prosecutors consulted Biden people, if the British consulted Biden people. Like, does the Biden administration want this thing to go away?
So it's interesting that you'd say that. Let me just plug the panel discussion I wrapped up with Noam Chomsky and Dan Ellsberg and Marjorie Cohn that the Assange Defense Committee hosted, because Noam actually says this. He says, if you believe in conspiracy, you would think that the Biden team consulted with the judge because this is perfect for them. Think about it. It upholds everything that the Biden administration would want, and they don't have to prosecute Julian Assange in order to have a precedent in this decision by the judge that would be useful to the U.S. government going forward. So it almost doesn't matter. And I've also been, in talking with some people today, highlighting the irony of all of this, of people who have constantly acted like, oh, this is an exception to the rule. Julian Assange isn't really a journalist. This is very unique. They wouldn't really come after journalists. But think of it this way. Everyone who treated this as like an anomaly, that Julian Assange isn't really, like them, he's now got off on a technicality. And they're the ones who are in trouble. They're the ones who are going to be left in the future trying to figure out how to protect themselves from being targeted. I mean, what do you say to that?
That's right. That's probably the most dangerous development in this whole odyssey. And that is that the mainstream media, print and broadcast, failed to rally around Julian. They failed to support Julian on their editorial pages. And so here's Julian getting off on a technicality, and still there's a path for American journalists at A-list outlets doing their job, investigative journalism, national security reporting, who now face Espionage Act charges, and they have only themselves to blame because they did not support Julian in the first place.
Yeah, and I'm just imagining, what if they had been louder? What if some of these people who have spoken up for Julian Assange in the last 2 weeks, because it was like fashionable to do so as the clamor for a pardon from Trump escalated. What if, Alan Rusbridger has been outspoken. I give him credit. But the New York Times put their editorial in support of Assange in their newspaper within the last month, and not sooner. So what if these places had been more vocal all along? Maybe the judge wouldn't have been, so concerned that she would upset the national security agencies if she rebutted the charges and allegations that were put forward by the prosecutors. But it's clear to me that it looks like she's looking for a kind of loophole because, I've always treated her as a kind of careerist. She's concerned about her future, but she also knows that she doesn't want her name to be tied to a destructive outcome. I mean, I think this is as much about her as it is about Julian Assange. Vanessa Baraitser does not want her career to be followed by the fact that Julian Assange came to the United States and then killed himself in a U.S. prison. And so she doesn't care about Julian Assange's health. She just cares that people might come after her and dislike her because Julian Assange hurt himself.
Yeah, I think you're right. You know, and this is the thing about these civil servants, be they prosecutors or judges. This is how they get promoted, right? Prosecutors don't get promoted by not prosecuting people. They get promoted by prosecuting people, convicting them, or forcing a plea, and then getting the longest possible sentence. Well, here's a judge who's working in a country that has draconian national security laws, and she's examining this extradition request from another country that has draconian national security laws. So what does she want to do? She wants to show that she's a team player. She's not trying to upset the apple cart and declare the Espionage Act and the Official Secrets Act null and void. So she gives us this long soliloquy on how the Department of Justice proved its case, that Julian did all these terrible things. He leaked all this classified information, but for humanitarian reasons, he's not going to be extradited. It wasn't, I agree with you, it wasn't for humanitarian reasons. She was able to say all the right things to ensure her career, and then make it so that he didn't come to the United States and kill himself in a prison cell in the end. Everybody wins.
Everybody wins. So just let me take a minute here. I want to read this exceptional part, which is that not only is she finding he's going to be held in SAMS, but that he would be sent to ADX Florence. And I just want to take a minute to read this section, if you'll permit me. I think it's really important context for people so that we get out here what it would be like if Julian Assange ended up, or if he had been authorized to be sent to the US and was on this path to being held in ADX Florence. This is laid out in the Center for Constitutional Rights report. And first off, just let me take a moment, because it was such, this man was a mentor of Julian Assange. Let me just pay tribute to Michael Ratner right now and say, how disappointed I am that he can't be here to share in the elation we're all feeling today. I know this is one of the people in Julian Assange's life that he's been greatly missing, but there's a report that the Constitutional Rights worked on called The Darkest Corner in 2017, and the judge quotes from it. So I just want people to be aware. If you don't know what SAMs are like at ADX Florence, it goes like this. Prisoners are generally allowed a total of 10 hours outside their cell per week. However, the time is spent alone in a small indoor room or a cage hardly bigger than their cell. Inmates are forbidden from communicating with other prisoners, for example, by yelling through the walls. Communications with people outside the prison are usually restricted to their lawyers and a few immediate family members who must be cleared by the U.S. government. SAMs typically restrict prisoners to writing one letter per week to a single family member, and this may not exceed their 3 double-sided sheets of paper. And they're forwarded to an FBI agent for approval. Over time, the delays in receiving mail can degrade the quality of communication between a prisoner and his family to the point where it can feel worthless. Phone calls are severely restricted and contemporaneously monitored. During non-legal in-person visits, no physical contact is allowed, with conversations taking place through a thick glass barrier and prisoners shackled and chained at their wrists, ankles, and to the ground. 14 days advance notice required for visits. And these can take months to coordinate because SAM's prisoners cannot use a visiting room when any other prisoner is present. These are all of the things that she had to factor into her decision. And, I asked, I'm talking to you, you were sentenced to prison for 30 months. You weren't ever under any of these kinds of restrictions, but you did have a special designation. You were treated differently than some of the other inmates at the low security prison. So you have some experience with how, people who run the prison could treat you differently. What do you have to say to this, Pat? Because I'm really actually stunned that she agreed he would be sent to ADX Florence. That was actually highly debated during the extradition trial, because there are other places he could go. There are other facilities. But the fact that she believes he could be sent to one of the worst hellholes in the United States, that's pretty huge.
It's huge. That is the worst hellhole in the United States, at least among federal prisons. There was a terrific expose that was published in the New York Times Magazine in May of 2015. I remember it now, 5.5 years later, because it was so impactful. And it talked about ADX Florence and what it's like living there in solitary confinement or in one of the special administrative units. And one prisoner, and they talked about this prisoner because this was typical of what prisoners experience at ADX Florence. But one prisoner was so distraught at not having human contact with anybody that he broke a window in his cell and he ate the glass. He ate the broken glass just so that it would shred his stomach so he could go to an outside hospital and at least interact with another human being. That's how bad things get. Now, and when they say that you're allowed outside your cell for 10 hours a week, that's not exactly true. What that means is at the back of the cell is a small door, and the door leads outside to a cage, and the cages are usually about 10 feet by 10 feet. And so for 1 hour a day, you can walk in a circle in that 10-foot by 10-foot enlarged dog cage that's attached to the back of your cell. So you're not really out of the cell per se. You're just able to get a little bit of fresh air for 1 hour. And then you're allowed 2 or 3 times a week out of the cell to take a shower. And that's it. People who are in solitary confinement are not permitted phone calls except to their attorneys, as you noted, or as the judge noted. You have to, just like you see on TV in the movies, if you have a visitor, which is rare, it's behind that glass wall and you have to have a phone and talk to your visitor over the phone. And then if you receive a letter, you don't physically get a copy of the letter. What they do is there's a screen, like a TV screen or a monitor that's attached to the ceiling, and they'll scan your letter and you're allowed to look up at the monitor at the ceiling, and they'll have it there for 5 minutes. You read it in that 5 minutes, and then they take it away and they destroy the letter. So it's enough to make the most sane person insane. I don't know how anybody over the long term can survive something like that. And let's face it, Julian was looking at 175 years in prison. Nobody can survive a lifetime of that.
The most charitable sort of view was that he would be there for the rest of his life for about a 40-year sentence.
Yes.
That Thomas Durkin's an attorney in Chicago who has done a lot of work on national security and civil liberties cases, and he provided testimony. And, you know, one of the things that he assessed was that it could be about 40 years if it wasn't a maximum sentence. And even there, you know, he's a 50-year-old man. Do we think Julian Assange is going to live to be 90 years old? Probably not in his condition.
No,
I mean, we just have to be realistic here. And so any time in prison more than 20 to 30 years is probably a death sentence.
It's a death sentence. Kevin, you and I have had this conversation several different times, but when I was in prison, and again, this was a low security prison, people were dropping like flies. You know, you've got cancer, they give you Tylenol. You have emphysema, you get a Tylenol. Or diabetes, you get a Tylenol. Half the people in there are insane. One of the psychologists told me that 85% of prisoners in American federal prisons have some sort of mental illness. 85%. Well, people who are mentally ill generally don't take a very good care of themselves physically as well. And then on top of that, you're in a prison where it's difficult to take care of yourself physically. The food is not human grade food. We've also talked about that. It's very, very carb heavy. So you're not eating healthy foods. You lack medical care. A lot of people have these chronic conditions, and then you die. And that's it. So sure, if the average life expectancy in the United States is what, 78 for men and 81 for women, you're not making it to 78 in a federal prison. You're just not.
And the other thing is, beyond the mental health, I mean, we got insight into the fact that he suffers from osteoporosis and
Right.
could be bending over and suffer a fracture.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way he's getting any appropriate attention from anyone inside the prison to treat that condition.
Well, osteoporosis is one of those conditions that is not treated in U.S. prisons. Like they'll treat you if you have something immediate. You've got diabetes, they will give you insulin. You've got a heart condition, they'll give you heart medication. But something like osteoporosis, they're not going to treat. Hepatitis C, they don't treat because it's very expensive. So you just have to lump it. There was a prisoner in my housing unit who had a quite a long sentence and had hepatitis C. And there was a court ruling saying that the prison had to give him this medication. I think it was $1,000 a month. It was when it first came out. And what they did is they just released him. They just let him go. Here you go. We're not paying for this. So they're not going to give you the medications that you need. And something like osteoporosis is going to take a toll over a long period of time, and it's going to make for a miserable life if it's not treated.
So what's your reaction to, aside from this aspect, which we can give kudos, I suppose, to the judge for being on the right side. Aside from this, a lot of the rest is pretty horrible. And I must probably spend the rest of the week digging through it and doing reports and piecing out what I know from covering the extradition trial is complete bunk from the judge. But one thing I know that you could react to, because we've talked about it, is the fact that she accepted, based upon a CNN story from 2019 about how they fabricated some thing that was laundered by U.S. government officials or NatSec officials about the embassy being used as an election meddling command center, that they said the embassy. So she agreed that the embassy might have been used for this purpose by Assange. And so the spying operation, which we have all kinds of details about, could have been reasonable. And what's your reaction to this?
Right. That was one of the first things that I thought of when I woke up this morning and saw what the decision was. My thought was, I wonder what she said about the spying operation. And I was disappointed because she should have condemned the spying operation. To me, the spying operation should have been enough to result in Julian's release in the first place. And she just didn't address it, at least not in any substantive way. I agree with you. I'm outraged at the notion, and this is considered to be unethical in the United States. Judges are not allowed to, Google you or look for articles about you. That's just forbidden. And she freely admitted that that's exactly what she did to help her decide this case. I was flabbergasted by it.
I mean, it's an article that was given to her by the prosecutors, but it can hardly be claimed to be primary evidence. I mean, it's just, hey, let's float this idea that he might be working for the Russians out of the Ecuador embassy. Meanwhile, for those who don't know about this article, there's been some good write-ups about it at the Gray Zone. I did my own write-up about it because these are the exact same documents that El País had.
Yes.
And they at least responsibly looked at each other and went, we're not going to make up some story about him working for the Russians. What's important here is that this shows evidence of his legal team being targeted by some private security outfit. And we don't really know if the CIA or the FBI is behind it, but we do know that some private security contractors should probably be pursued for committing criminal acts.
Yes.
Because they should not be doing this.
Agreed. And I think we do have to assume that it was the CIA behind it. Even though the FBI would have had primacy on this case, the CIA always has primacy overseas. And so it likely would have been a CIA operation. oftentimes, and I think this is apropos of Julian's situation. Oftentimes, it's more cost effective and it's safer to contract it out to a private firm. The CIA does that all the time. I think that's what we saw here. This was essentially a CIA operation that was just farmed out.
To bring in Sheldon Adelson to help.
Can you imagine?
And it's actually not a really good operation because he already has yacht security. So you would scratch your head and say, well, you just hired David Morales for yacht security, but you already have this. So what is this person doing? Like, even people at the company weren't sure what this was about, because they're like, why does Sheldon Adelson need help with his yacht security? This is very confusing. So there's a couple things I want to ask you before we leave and end the broadcast. I've got some really nice people following our conversation.
Great.
Mexico is offering up political asylum to Julian Assange. What do you think about that?
I was thrilled to see the report. We'd have to wonder if the PRI is elected again, if there would be any impact on Julian. But I'll tell you what I was really worried about is that, let's say Julian wins this whole thing, the Brits expel him, there was nowhere for him to go, so he goes back to Australia, he's an Australian citizen. What's to keep the United States from then asking the Australians to extradite him? And he has to go through this whole thing all over again. So when I saw that the Mexicans had offered him asylum, I couldn't think of better news.
Well, the other problem here is that there are these allegations outstanding that have nothing to do with these 2010 offenses. And I think the cloud hanging over Julian Assange is going to be what to do. There's, it's very clear in this decision from Vanessa Baretzer that she recognizes that the authorities could come after him for the Vault 7 materials. Those are highly, highly classified. Those are like revealing the crown jewels, right, of how the CIA cyber operations. So, I think there is a reasonable fear, and I think that's going to be difficult for Julian and his people to figure out what to do once this case ends, because I think the question becomes, does Joe Biden decide to pursue a case on very different grounds?
Yeah, I think that's really a great question. Remember, it was the Obama-Biden administration that prosecuted almost 3 times as many whistleblowers as all previous presidents combined. I don't think that Joe Biden becoming president is any great help for Julian Assange. I'll say also, I have to agree with your assessment that it's going to be difficult for Julian to actually do something for a living once this is over. Let's say he ends up in Mexico in the next 3 weeks or so. What does he do? If he goes back to WikiLeaks, he makes himself a target. And you know that the Justice Department is licking its chops over prosecuting the Vault 7 leaks. I mean, like you said, these were the crown jewels. These are probably the most sensitive intelligence-related documents that have ever been leaked. They're going to want to scalp for that leak, besides just the guy who released the information. So I would worry about Julian and his future. Eventually the spotlight is going to leave him. He's got 2 children now. He has a partner who's very loving and supportive, and so he's going to want to get along with his life. We just don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, and I wouldn't fault him if he wanted to just hang it up and move on with having a family. I think that was probably part of his consideration when he decided to have children. He believed that he was going to be able to get out of this embassy because he didn't think that the Obama administration and he didn't think the Trump administration. He did not think that the Obama administration was going to come after him anymore. And in 2017, with the way that Trump had been talking about him, I think he thought that he might be insulated somewhat. Right. Although it turned out to be wrong. It turned out that Jeff Sessions could do what he wanted with the Justice Department without Donald Trump getting involved. But let me just also put forward this scenario, because we've got on the other side of the globe, we've got people in Australia that are watching us talk. So I think let's conclude here, which is, Australia has grown pretty hostile towards whistleblowers and the publication of information. So what if he ends up going back to Australia with his family because that's where he was born, and then they just return to pursuing an extradition there? Maybe they decide within the Justice Department and the Biden administration, we don't want to deal with the UK government because we got this issue about our prisons and that's set precedent. Let's try Australia and see if they'll let us get Julian Assange to the United States. The government there is, I don't know if you're familiar, but I think his name's David McBride, who has done the revealing of war crimes in Afghanistan, and he's facing quite a harsh prosecution.
Yes.
So, well, that could be a great place to turn to get Julian Assange.
Yeah, that's why I was so happy about Mexico. The Australian government is quite conservative. And even by conservative standards, they're very, very conservative when it comes to whistleblower issues. Whistleblowers are not protected in Australia, especially national security whistleblowers. This is something that several different NGOs are working on in Australia, especially Blueprint for Free Speech, which does a lot of these whistleblower legislative projects around the world. Even though they're based in Australia, they have a devil of a time trying to convince Australian politicians that whistleblowers ought to be protected. So yeah, I agree. If I were Julian, I wouldn't want to go to Australia right now. I would try to get to Mexico as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think he has more. His fortunes could actually be much better if he was able to repair his standing in Ecuador than if he tried to go to Australia. Like, personally, I think you probably want to go find a place in Latin America before you head to Australia. Yeah, I would be careful about the kind of governments, but I mean, Bolivia's done pretty well to beat back the United States, so maybe he should go befriend Evo Morales and live in Bolivia.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you. There's one more thing I'll close with, just to see if you recognized the fact that Chelsea Manning featured in the decision. I don't know if you saw this, but
not see that.
So she referred to her suicide attempt as reason why Julian Assange should not be extradited to the United States, which I thought was just an incredible thing for the United States overzealousness against the source of these documents to come back and bite them so directly. I mean, if you think about it, they were already done with her. They had already succeeded in breaking her. And they said, hey, let's bring her back. Let's bring her back and just try to get her and turn her against Julian Assange and make her testify against this WikiLeaks founder. And she stood up to them. And then because she stood up to them and then, was mentally abused again, but survived, the judge is now referencing that in a case against the U.S. government to justify not extraditing Julian Assange. I mean, I think it's wonderful. And also it's a tribute to Chelsea Manning, because I do think that when all is said and done, there's really a lot that Julian owes. And it's not that he has to do anything for her. It's just that, she's really done a good job here of being silent, of saying nothing, and just letting this happen without any kind of divide being opened between her and Julian Assange.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I said, actually, I think I said it to you at the time, that Chelsea Manning was consistently underestimated, not just through her trial, but when she was being held in contempt of court for refusing to testify against Julian before a grand jury. She was far, far tougher than the Justice Department ever gave her credit for being. So it is kind of poetic justice that it comes back to bite prosecutors.
I mean, the only thing that ever really gets them right is their overzealousness and how far the U.S. government goes, beyond it. They never know when to stop. They always find a way to be their own enemy. So I know you have to go, and I want to wrap up here, but just as we conclude, thank you everyone for following the broadcast. I want to thank you, John, for joining again.
My pleasure.
If you go to Consortium News, you're still doing coverage of the Bureau of Prisons and the inhumanities and cruel abuses inside of the prison system, which will remain important to this appeal. I mean, I guess the last thing I can say here on our way out of this broadcast is it's a very narrow appeal that the U.S. is able to file, but I'm going to enjoy every bit of it. And you know why I'm going to enjoy every bit of it? Because the U.S. is going to have to prove that their prison system isn't cruel and vile before a 3-panel appeals court in the United Kingdom. And I'm kind of in the mood right now where I'm grabbing the popcorn to hear whatever they try to come up with. And that maybe it's hubris, but I just kind of feel like they're not going to have an easy time coming up with anything that's persuasive.
I have to agree. There's no defense of this system, none. So I'm anxious to hear what kind of tale they try to spin.
All right, everyone. Well, as we end, you can subscribe to the Shadowproof channel on YouTube, and I encourage you to do so. And until next time, thank you, and I'll see you all around.